this is the second night, but there were a couple of very interesting calls last night about this very subject. One woman called and said, why couldn't you equip airplanes with a way that in the cockpit they could release something that would put everybody in the passenger's compartment to sleep? If you had a camera looking into the passenger's compartment and you saw trouble start, why couldn't you release something that would knock everybody out? Somebody else called and said, vis-a-vis putting armed sky marshals on the flights, he was a retired cop. And he said, you know, we've had the training. We know about weapons. We know how to handle crisis situations. What about recruiting retired law enforcement people who have, you know, not that much to do now to do this until they can train a younger crop of so the American spirit and ingenuity is alive and well. Let's go to Gary Utley. We're halfway through this broadcast tonight. It's 1 o'clock in the East. Gary Utley has the latest news headlines for us now. Gary?
Thanks, Jack. We're going to go downtown and look again at Lower Manhattan. Gary Tuckman was just reporting there a short while ago about the only good news, and this is very slim good news, as you can see, in Lower Manhattan, is that it is a beautiful night once again. We've only had one sort of chilly, bad, wet, stormy night here. It was a couple nights ago. Otherwise, it's been good conditions, and that's important, not only for the physical safety of the rescue workers there, but also for their emotional condition. They don't have to fight the elements. Anyway, as Gary Tuckman reported, it's been 120 hours now since the last survivor was found. Hopes are fading. The death toll, the official confirmed dead, is 190, but still more than 4,900, nearly 5,000 are missing. And after last week's devastating attacks, New York and Washington are at last ready to get back to work. That's the New York Stock Exchange down there on Wall Street. George Washington getting a hose down because of all the dust, the flags flying at the Stock Exchange there. Streets are being cleaned. The opening bell is less than 9 hours away now. And trading will get underway. We'll see what happens in the markets, what Americans think of the economic future of their land. Turning to President Bush. Now, there's a view of Wall Street. You can see the more of the dust there. It was really a mess. I was down there today. President Bush returned to the White House on Sunday, and he is telling Americans that it's time to get back to work. The president, as we know, was meeting with his officials up at Camp David. And when he returned, he wanted to say some things to the American people. Here's some of what he had to say.
This war on terrorism is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient, but I can assure the American people I am determined. I'm not going to be distracted. I will keep my focus to make sure that not only are these brought to justice, but anybody who's been associated will be brought to justice.
This weekend, many Americans celebrated their patriotism. Look at this. This is Tucson, Arizona. 25,000 people gathered to show their true colors. A very human statement. The effort that went into that, just imagine that. In Brooklyn, on Sunday, Brooklyn, New York, the message was the same but more somber as thousands attended a vigil in Brooklyn Heights, just across the river from the World Trade Center disaster. Finally, a peaceful look at the Empire State Building along Fifth Avenue this evening, Midtown, Manhattan. Tonight, it's showing its true colors, red, white, and blue. The lights had been turned off much of last week. Well, the man who is believed to be the leader in the terrorist attack, Osama bin Laden, #1 on everybody's most wanted list in the world today, he's saying that once again that he did not do it. Don't hold him responsible. He's not guilty. He, of course, is the man that has been fingered by just about everybody in the world. And now he's released a statement really underlining that he had nothing to do with it. So let's go through the statement. There's some interesting aspects to this. He said, after the recent attacks which the U.S. has witnessed, the U.S. government ventured to point fingers at me, accuse me of involvement. The U.S. government has consistently blamed me for being behind every occasion its enemies attack it, that is the United States. And it goes on. I would like to assure the world that I did not plan the recent attacks, which seems to have been planned by people for personal reasons. And as for me, I have been living in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and following its leader's rules. The current leader does not allow me to exercise such operations. Well, Jack, we can all weigh that on the scale of credibility and come to our own conclusions. Let me just add one little thought here. A very important news development, which we're going to be following for the next few days, is in that part of the world. Pakistan today, Monday, is sending a message to the Afghan leaders saying, hand over bin Laden within 3 days or face the consequences. We'll see what comes out from that, what the Afghan response is going to be. But it's important because we're all waiting to see what and where and when and how the next shoe will drop in this tragedy. By having this 3-day deadline, at least, it seems that we'll have through Wednesday before any missiles or guns are going to be fired or any moves like that. So we'll all be keeping our eyes on the response from Afghanistan to that Pakistani message. Jack?
Indeed. All right. Thanks a lot. Gary Cutley, the latest news. Randy in Minnesota, we're going to get to you in 2 seconds. I want to ask Mansour Ijaz to put his Council of Foreign Relations hat on here for a minute and talk with the knowledge about the Middle East. President Bush said, in effect, you're either with us or you're against us in this thing. Mm-hmm. And that goes to a lot of non-Middle Eastern countries as well. But the other part of the statement was, if you harbor, grant refuge, comfort to terrorism or to terrorists, you are no different than the terrorists themselves. Is he going to have to modify or back off that in some way? I mean, if you apply a strict definition of what he said, you're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about Syria, you're talking about a lot of countries that it could get very tricky applying the strict definition of what he said to. How's he going to handle that?
I think that definitions here are not probably the most important way to look at this. Essentially what the president has to do is create a consensus amongst the Organization of Islamic Countries, the OIC.
Okay.
If he can persuade Saudi Arabia to lead the ball for him within the OIC, and the OIC includes countries like Sudan and Syria and even Iraq.
Right.
Now, they may abstain, they may not want, then at least we know who the real guilty parties are.
Right, that'll be a clue, right?
Exactly.
Sure.
Now, if he gets that part done, that represents a core nucleus, which he can then take to Russia,
I was going to say,
China.
if he can do that, he can go to the rest of the world and say, look who I've got on board this thing. What are you waiting for?
Now,
right?
the moment that happens, quite frankly, I think that even the Taliban doesn't have much of a chance at that moment.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I think part of what has happened here today as the Pakistanis go to Afghanistan is to say to them, look, whatever happened here, whoever's responsible, this was too much. You guys overstepped your bounds.
Yeah.
You know, you in a sense, what they did was destroy their own movement. And that is what bin Laden is worried about. That
Right.
essentially, he may even have not given the order on this one.
That old
And maybe he
cliche.
was a subcontractor.
Yeah.
But essentially, he knows that the game is over now.
Careful what you wish for, you might
Exactly.
get it. All right.
Exactly.
Randy, I'm sorry to keep you waiting in Minnesota. How's everything in the Northland?
Pretty good.
What can we
I have
do
a
for you?
two-part question
Go ahead.
for you. What could we have possibly done for these people to hate us so bad? And secondly, what is their eventual goal? What would make them happy? What do they want out of all of this?
Mansour probably has the answer to both of your questions. We touched on part of it in the first hour of the program, but let's go back and quickly do it again.
I think what we have done to them is essentially rail on their sensitivity of what they conceive their religion to be. We lived, until last Tuesday, we lived 2 oceans apart from everybody, a benign neighbor to the north and a benign neighbor to the south. We essentially had no natural enemies, whereas just about every other country in the world doesn't have that sort of situation with them. Now, bin Laden's biggest complaint has always been that America, with its beer-drinking ways and military assets, came and essentially soiled what he considered to be the Holy Land.
We were the infidels.
We were the infidels. And he didn't understand that the real infidels were sitting right amongst him all the time. They don't admit that part. That's the problem with these people.
Sure.
They don't admit what's wrong with them. They only want to admit what's wrong with us. Now, so I think that is what we have done in their perception for them to hate us as much as they do. Now, can we do anything to rectify that? Well, my judgment is that the way you do that is you go to these countries and you say, all right, if there is that kind of a structural problem, what we are prepared to do is, if you guys are prepared to come clean with us on what is wrong, we're prepared to help build you up into something more than what we did before. One thing I disagreed with Larry on before, and that is that you cannot say that the United States gave trillions of dollars in aid and nothing ever came of it. We gave trillions of dollars worth of aid and never gave a prescription of how it should be used.
Right. It was just throw money at the problem.
That is why we got into
throw money at the problem, like we do with drugs, like we do with a whole lot of other things, without ever understanding what's structurally wrong with the thing to begin with. Coming up at the bottom of the hour, by the way, in case you're getting tired and it's Sunday night and you want to go to bed, I'm here to tell you should not, because on CNNI, which is one of the sister networks, I'm told we will have a live interview with a Pakistani foreign minister at sometime around 1:30 Eastern Time, perhaps talking about the results of that mission to deliver some sort of ultimatum to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Patricia Chadwick, you've been without a stock exchange for a week. This is an unprecedented situation in our country. But during that time, have your clients had access to you, the people, customers of your firm? And if so, what have they been saying to you? What are you saying to them? What kinds of conversations can we eavesdrop on with you here?
I think for the most part, the customers have wanted to feel sure that their portfolios were okay, their securities were safe, the transactions that had taken place were done, and that, you know, the firm was okay. Now, in certain cases, as we know, firms have been eliminated practically.
But before we just leave that there, most of those have backup systems to preserve all the records, the portfolios. Right. I mean, the investments are safe even though the businesses may be gone.
Disaster recovery, and even though they're doing it with fewer people, you know, in essence, customers wanted to be assured that business would go on for the most part, except for those places where it was impossible to get to work. People went to work even though the market wasn't open.
All right, once you told them, look, there's nothing wrong, your portfolio's safe, don't worry, your investments are there, you know, then what? What's the next thing on their mind?
Well, I think for the most part, you know, what do we feel the implications of all that's happened will be? Mostly, I think, concerned that there'll be liquidity in the marketplace when it opens up.
Has the Fed done enough, by the way, in your opinion, to support and shore up these markets, or should they have cut rates maybe before the stock market opened tomorrow?
I think the expectation is that they will cut them significantly, as much as maybe 50 basis points tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
I think it could be a disappointment in the marketplace if they didn't.
If they don't.
They have sworn that they will provide all the liquidity, and in fact, as long as they provide all the liquidity they need, rates will be coming down. And I think there's every sense that they will do that.
The beauty is that we have a Federal Reserve chairman who's been through this over and over and over.
Just not here in this way in this country.
Right.
What about that, Larry? What's your thought about the Fed? You write that column for Investors Business Daily. Has Greenspan done enough? We got to remember that he was busy raising rates that some say contributed to this economic slowdown we're in the middle of. So a lot of these rate cuts early in the cycle were simply taking back rate increases that served to slow the economy. And some economists and analysts that I've talked to over on CNN-FM, the business network, have been critical of the Fed, saying that they remain behind the curve, at least going into this event that happened Tuesday.
Well, that's right. A lot of people have made those kinds of criticisms. But I think the real question is what impact does the Federal Reserve have really on the economy? And I think there is an impact, but not a significant impact. The real impact has to do with tax, spend, and regulation policies. And quite frankly, we have doubled the burden of the American taxpayer since 1950, which is one of the reasons why we have a lot more secondary wage earners working outside the home. If the government really wants to do something to stimulate the economy, get the government off the backs of hardworking men and women. We have to work right now until almost the first week of July in order just to pay all of the taxes that we have to pay, federal, state, and local.
Well, didn't we just get this huge tax cut? Didn't all our taxes just go down? I guess not.
Pardon me?
I said, didn't we just get this huge tax cut?
If you call $300, $600 a huge, then
I was being
definition that I have. I know you
I was being facetious.
I know you were. Look, since 1900, about 10% of the American taxpayers was taken state, local, and federal. Right now, it's almost 50% if you count unfunded mandates. So let's get the American government off the backs of hardworking men and women. Let us do our own retirement, our own health care, our own medical needs, fund money for protecting people and property, and let the country do what it's supposed to do and let people do what they're supposed to do.
Do you think Bush should listen to a capital gains tax cut here right now?
I hope he would. Any kind of tax cut right now, as far as I'm concerned, that puts money back into the pockets of the American people is a good thing. We ought not be running surpluses. Surpluses mean the American people are being overtaxed.
Yeah, it's a drag on the economy, a surplus. I mean, it's in the economic way of looking at things, you're right. Capital gains tax cut. Bush had said when the subject came up in Washington a week or 10 days ago, maybe at some point down the road he'd look at it, but he wasn't ready yet. Does this event change the possibility that the street may get something like that, which would be helpful.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the Congress has changed a bit.
Yeah.
You know, they've spent all their time bickering about, I mean, they were poles apart on issues that they were really not meant to be at all apart on.
Right.
So it was surplus versus deficit and just the innuendo of all that. This has coalesced them. I mean, if you remember back when Bush Sr., Bush father, was trying to get a declaration of war against Iraq.
Right.
I remember being in Paris at the time and just sitting there glued to the television, afraid he wasn't going to get it. And I think he got it 51-49 or something like that.
52-48, if I recall.
52-48, okay.
You're close, yeah.
And here we got 98-0.
Nothing.
So, I mean, there is a tremendous coalescence that hopefully will allow the Congress to say we need something more in the way of taxes, be it capital gains or just more on income tax. I'm not sure it matters too much which it is. I totally agree with Larry that when we run a surplus, you're taking money out of the economy, and that it's a drain.
All right, Joey in Maryland, you're on the air with us. Welcome to the program. How are you getting along?
Pretty good. Just hard to believe that this all just happened on Tuesday, you know?
Isn't it? I mean, it's mind-boggling. In a way, it seems that it happened a long time ago, maybe because of the weariness that we all feel from the emotional drain. What can we help you with? Anything?
Well, my question was on our new war on terrorism. I'm completely behind a military response, but it just seems to me like this may be a war in terms of like the war on drugs. It may not be able to be won in the end, you know? I mean, even if Afghanistan turns over bin Laden, or they don't and we go in there and somehow, you know, kill him or what have you, I heard it reported earlier in the week that he's not so much a man but an idea. And how can we...
And that's a very accurate way to portray him. The symbolism around this guy is huge and growing bigger by the minute. You're right, he's a symbol. But, I mean, we prosecuted a war in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein's still walking around, so your point's well taken about how successful we may or may not be at the end of the day. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Jack, I would say that's why the American people have to understand this is going to be in for the long haul. This is a war against people that are secretive, people that hide in holes. You're not going to have a trophy like you have in most conventional wars where there's a clear demarcation of territory.
Sure.
We're talking about 5,000 people all over the world who are determined to exterminate our way of life because they consider us to be the great Satan. It is going to be a very long haul.
Major Garrett at the White House, you know, these are valid points, and the polls indicate, as they always do, that the longer the potential military action goes on, the less appetite the public will have for it, and that old argument that when the body bags start coming home and we in the media begin to show everybody in America what the real price of this stuff is, maybe the appetite begins to diminish. What about that?
Well, I think you've seen a rather painstaking effort from the president and his senior advisors, especially on the talk shows on Sunday, to channel what is clearly strong public support for the directions the administration is preparing the country to take, channeling that in a way that says, yes, we're going to be responsive, yes, we're going to be effective, yes, we're going to be comprehensive, but in all of those pursuits, we're going to need you to, A, be patient, and we're going to need you to be with us for the long haul. Secretary of State Colin Powell said today that this could take years, not months, absolutely years. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense rather, said much the same thing. Vice President Cheney said all of us have to be prepared not only to wage this war internationally, build new coalitions, but also understand our way of life in this country is going to change. So the administration, I think, is trying, because it's aware of so many of the points you just brought up, that it has to channel this public support and nurse it along, feed it, and keep it going for a good long while, because, as Larry just pointed out, this is not going to be the kind of endeavor where there's one beachhead secured, everyone looks around and says, that's it. We've driven the stake finally through the heart of our enemy. This is going to be a much more nebulous type of war to fight, and it's going to require much more sustained support. But going back to the earlier reference to the Gulf War and the very narrow passage in the Senate, 52-48 of the support for President Bush's father, the country was not so nearly of one mind then. It is clearly now. The White House knows that that is a very strong asset in their favor. What they have to do is channel it best they can for the long haul.
All right, thanks, Major. We're going to go to Islamabad, Pakistan. CNN's Mike Chenoy is standing by with a live report from Islamabad. Mike, what have you got for us?
Hello, Jack. Well, at this hour, a high-level Pakistani delegation is in the southern Afghan city of Kandahar to meet with the leaders of the Taliban. The Pakistani delegation is headed by the chief of Pakistan's military intelligence service. That is the part of the Pakistani establishment that has, over the past few years, had very close ties with the Taliban, ties involving military aid, political support. To some degree, Pakistani intelligence was responsible for bringing the Taliban to power in Afghanistan. And that delegation is going to be pressing the Taliban leadership to agree to turn Osama bin Laden over to the United States. The head of the delegation is reportedly carrying a letter from the United States detailing the evidence that Washington has so far acquired linking Osama bin Laden and his network to last week's terrorist attacks. At the same time, we're getting reports that either Pakistan's president or foreign minister will shortly be on their way to China and then to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the only other nations that maintain formal relations with the Taliban. Pakistan's government trying to be true to its promise that it will do what it can to help the United States line up support against Osama bin Laden and his backers in Afghanistan. That stance is provoking considerable controversy here in Pakistan. On Sunday, there were demonstrations in several parts of the country by opposition politicians and Islamic fundamentalists. They tend to support the Taliban's extreme version of Islam, and they have warned that if the government supports the United States to the extent that Washington is able to use Pakistan to take military action against Afghanistan, there could be trouble on the streets here. Jack?
I only mean this semi-facetiously. Do they know where the Taliban is? Because we're getting reports that they've gone into hiding and nobody knows where they are.
If anybody knows where the Taliban leadership is or how to reach them, it is Pakistani military intelligence. The head of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, normally lives in Kandahar. There have been reports that he has left Kandahar since the attacks last week, but presumably the Pakistanis know how to either reach him or get word to him of the message that they're delivering.
All right, Mike, thanks very much. Nice to have you with us. Mike Shenoy, live in Islamabad, Pakistan. Lynette in Texas, sorry to keep you waiting. We had a little breaking news. What can we help you with here tonight, this morning?
I had a question about economics.
Okay.
I am probably what you would call lower class, single parent Texan, an American, and there was a caller before me about investing now in economics to build it up.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be the best way for me to try to put some of my money into the economy to help the situation?
Well, we had another caller earlier ask that same question. Let me ask our panel here what they think you ought to be doing.
Well, again, I think it's first and foremost important that you don't spend over and above your means. You've just said that you don't have a very large income, so it's important that you take care of your needs and your family's needs. If, in fact, there's money that you feel you should be investing and want to invest, I would say that the time horizon that you need to take is a long one. And if you can take a long one, then I would argue that while the markets may remain volatile, and it's certainly likely that they will remain volatile for some period of time in here, that if you have a long time horizon, it can be a very wise idea to be putting some of your money into equities, which will only be helpful to you in the long run when you go to retire.
All right, Larry Elder, let me ask
Jack,
you. Yeah, go ahead.
Jack, her situation to me typifies why we need to have a discussion about the privatization of Social Security. A woman like that doesn't earn very much money. Her contribution and her employer's contribution, as you know, is controlled completely by the federal government. She ought to be able to put her money in stocks and bonds so that when she retires down the road, when she feels like retiring, not at an age that is mandated by the federal government, she'll have substantially more in assets than she otherwise would by our current Social Security plan. So hopefully this could get us to jumpstart the conversation that we need to have about allowing American men and women to put their own money in stocks and bonds for the long haul, so they're far better off than our current Social Security system.
All right, that's a debate. I have a hunch Larry's going to go onto the back burner here for probably quite a while, but it's a hot topic, and at some point down the road it'll be raised again. We've got a caller in Chicago. Rich, how you making out?
Hi, thank you. Good evening, or good morning, depending where you're at.
Yeah, right.
My question is to everybody in the panel there, maybe something you're listening to your listeners, is with all the millions of dollars being donated by these major corporations, I mean, and we're talking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars going through. Wouldn't it not have been better to keep the millions of dollars, even though it's commendable that they are doing this, and keep back or hire back employees that they've either laid off or hire new employees? Wouldn't the tax revenue generated from the employee back, help stimulate the economy a little bit better?
Yeah, it would, but let me just, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer it, but I'm going to take a shot at it. We've got 300 firefighters in this city that are never going to take another breath. We got 68 or 70 cops. They left families, they left kids. You know what, I don't know if you're married or have children, but I've got 4 of them. I know what it costs to put them in college and raise them and pay insurance for them and do all those things. And your point's well taken. As an economic stimulus, a couple of $100 million in an $11 trillion economy, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it's not all that much. But to those widows and orphans of the firefighters and the cops in this city, it's a whole bunch of money, and my sense is that maybe it's better there. I don't know.
Agreed.
Agreed?
Yeah.
Yeah, you understand what I'm getting at? I mean, I know what you're saying, and it's a good idea, but I mean,
neither are these mutually exclusive events.
Well, that's true too.
Because
eventually
just
the money
because
gets
Morgan
into the
Stanley
economy.
gives $10 million to the fund doesn't mean that they can't hire back, or hire more, or go out and stimulate from whatever else they have.
And I guess the money eventually will find its way into the economy through the families of these departed.
But I think there are other points. I mean, it's very hard for a corporation to go and hire back people when they don't have things for them to do, and they're in turmoil. But I will say I've thought a lot about how the economy might change, and of course we know that the airline industry is going to get fairly hard hit. A lot of people do not want to travel. A lot of corporations are telling their people they do not want them to travel.
Sure.
They have to get permission to travel right now. And yet when you think, okay, how could this be a benefit somewhere in the economy? On the technology side, we know that the technology for teleconferencing exists. Right. It's not utilized at all to the extent that it could be. And in a way, this might jumpstart some technology spending.
I was going to say, the technology sector of the stock market has been the one that has enjoyed the greatest losses, not enjoyed, but suffered the greatest losses, down 60-70% from that NASDAQ 5,000 tech bubble that we had almost 2 years ago now. And it's an interesting idea that corporations and businesses, as a way to keep in touch with clients, it may not be the salesman on his route anymore.
Right, and that is a tremendous productivity-enhancing situation. I also think everybody is going to have a cell phone who doesn't have one. People just feel the need to be able to communicate with anyone.
Look how they were used aboard these hijacked airliners.
Yeah. Sure.
Mansour, your office is downtown?
No, we're at Midtown.
The reason I ask, real estate investment trusts were all the rage as an investment, particularly with the stock market overall declining, because they paid a pretty nice dividend. You could get 5, 6, 7, 8% dividend along with potential appreciation of the shares in the companies. We have lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 million square feet of office space here in New York City as a result of this. There is some 25 million square feet available, but it's not the right kind. It's small parcels, little bitty rooms and offices scattered all over the city. The financial concerns that lost their office space in the World Trade Center incident need big rooms, conference rooms, etc. My question is, do real estate investment trusts change as a potential investment vehicle because of the potential for the kind of situation that we're seeing here in New York, perhaps, God forbid, happening in other cities? I mean, what about that? Is that too big a reach, do you think, or not?
Well, I would say on the real estate, I mean, I think, again, it depends on where your properties are. I mean, if you own the real estate downtown on Wall Street, your prospects are not so good. If you own pieces of real estate around town, and I'm very, intimately involved in a situation where suddenly real estate out in Westchester is probably going to go like that, and there has been
to relocate, right?
And there has been a lot of excess capacity out in that area as the economy has slowed down. So I think it really depends on how you're structured and where you are. But you're right, this extra 25 million square feet doesn't do too much good if you're a corporation of 1,000 people or you're trying to move 2,000 people. But you are probably going to see the supply-demand in general for real estate get extremely tight in this area. The next question will be, do some corporations not want to stay in New York? Of course, I think that this city and this state want to give big incentives to people to stay, and security measures will change. But some corporations may feel it's better not to have all their employees in one place and make sure that they have operations scattered around.
All right. We have Thomas in Alabama before we go to Gary Kutlick for the latest news. Thomas, good evening. Good morning.
How are you?
How you doing?
I would want to know, after all this is over with the United States freedom still be the same?
Boy, I don't know. Larry, you talk to people about civil liberties all the time. Is Larry Elder there? Garrick, let me push you back 1 second. You know, our lives, the government said it the day it happened. Our lives have changed forever. What about that?
Our lives have changed forever. Benjamin Franklin said any society that sacrifices freedom for security deserves neither. But clearly we have to rethink exactly how porous our borders are, how easy it is to get on an airplane, how easy it is to circulate throughout the country. We have to really think about the fact that we are now in a 21st century a war against terrorism, against people who are willing to come into the country and hijack planes. Lord knows what is in store of us next in terms of biochemical and nuclear weapons, and so we have to begin to think about sacrificing some of the freedoms and the convenience that we used to experience on a day-to-day basis. That can no longer be the status quo.
All right, 1:30 Eastern Time. Let's go to Garrick Utley and get the latest news. Garrick?
Jack, what the quote of one of your panels just a minute ago reminded me of the old Field of Dreams saying, build it and they will come. When you look downtown, and I was down there today, the big question is in terms of real estate, rebuild, and will they come back? Well, we just don't know. It's going to be months and years before we can even think about that. But let's look at these live pictures down there. As we know, the human toll, 190 dead, another 4,900 missing. And meanwhile, just blocks away, Wall Street says it's getting ready to go back to work. 8 hours from now, the big bell in the New York Stock Exchange, the big board, will be ringing away and trading begins. In Washington, cleanup at the Pentagon continues there, just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. The death toll there at the Pentagon stands at 188, 187 missing, and 2 confirmed dead. Earlier on Sunday, the Bush administration called on the leaders of the world to stand up and be counted.
The key here to keep in mind is that what we're asking nations to do, and which the PACs have clearly made a decision to do, is we're asking nations to step up and be counted. They're going to have to decide. Are they going to stand with the United States and believe in freedom and democracy and civilization, or are they going to stand with the terrorists and the barbarians, if you will? And it's a fairly clear-cut choice, and I'm delighted to see that Pakistan has, in fact, stepped up to the task.
Across the country, the manhunt continues with the FBI agents spreading out. Just a few hours ago, 2 arrest warrants were issued for 2 more material witnesses in Delray Beach, Florida today. The FBI stepped up its search of this apartment complex. Authorities there believe at least 1, if not 2, suspected hijackers were living there. And finally, the long healing process begins. Americans lit candles across the country to mourn the victims from the attacks, the disaster last Tuesday. And as the vigils continue, President Bush is calling on Americans to do one very important thing, not only to get back to work, but to recreate a sense of normalcy in this country, normalcy in the United States, all 50 states. The president returned to the White House Sunday from Camp David, urging Americans to go back to work. He returned after meeting with his top security advisors at Camp David, discussing likely responses to last week's attacks. Meanwhile, the man the president has fingered as the prime suspect, Osama bin Laden, issued a statement on Sunday denying once again that he had any role in Tuesday's attacks. He says he's been living in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and following the rules and the laws of that country's leaders. Well, Jack, again, as we reported just a moment ago from Islamabad, correspondent Mike Chinoy there, the big story is the meeting taking place this Monday between the head of military intelligence of Pakistan and the Taliban leaders. Pakistan telling the Taliban, hand over bin Laden within the next 3 days or else. This is the real test, perhaps the last chance, it seems, according to informed observers there, to have a peaceful resolution to this. No one's giving high hopes that it's going to happen. Anyway, 3 days and counting until that deadline reaches us. Back to you.
Garrick, our sister network CNNI is promising shortly, in fact any time now, a live interview with the Pakistani foreign minister, presumably, hopefully, we'll see, but hopefully they'll have some information about that meeting between the Taliban and the Pakistani officials. Mansour, you've got close to $1 billion under management in your firm. How much equity exposure do you have?
Well, we're primarily invested in private equity transactions. So from a public stock market standpoint, I sort of got out of the public markets about 2.5, 3 years ago, primarily because we saw, when you've had that kind of a 5-year run, you don't kick a gift horse in the mouth and you say, all right, where can we go and do some more interesting things? And some of the things that we're trying to do right now include very novel internet paradigms that are designed to protect the internet security, infrastructure security in ways that have never been seen before.
Can you talk about what they are? Or is it...
Well, let me give you a hint, and that is that the ability to protect a computer up until now has depended on building these very elaborate firewalls.
Right.
Now what we're doing is, in fact, taking the internet address of the computer and moving it around in cyberspace so you can't find the computer. If you can't find it, you can't attack it. That's one thing we're doing. Other things we're doing, biomass conversion. We're very interested in satellite technologies. Telecommunications, I think, will have a resurgence as a result of these kinds of things because of what Patricia just said, which is that we've never used a teleconference capability anywhere in the world, and now I think we're going to do that. And in fact, Pakistan is a very good place to do that, as a matter of fact. And they're privatizing their telecom company. And if they survive this short-term crisis, I think there's a lot to be done in those kinds of countries to build their infrastructure out as well.
All right. Timothy, here in New York. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you getting along?
Oh, it's been a rough week.
Yeah, it has.
You know, I mean, as much as everyone's talking about the economy and everything, being so close to these two tragic events here in New York, being a Long Islander, I kind of felt like being trapped in a way.
That's why they shut the city down. You were trapped in a way. Were you out on the island when this happened, or were you in the city?
Yeah, I was out on the island at work. But basically, my question has to do with everything that has taken place on American soil, you know, not being a military strike as Pearl Harbor, but yet being terrorist attacks for, quote, personal interests, as Osama bin Laden has put it. Wouldn't it be rational and logical for the United States to close its doors for an extended period of time to allow the government to both scour the country of any and all illegal immigrants and also to devise a better system of security for the sole purpose of protection?
I don't know that it's a practical idea, and I'm not an official, but a practical idea to seal off the borders. I do know that, I would expect, I would strongly suspect, that the examination of things like student visas will come under a little scrutiny. Apparently, some of these terrorists that hijacked these airplanes were attending flight schools here in the United States because they got into the country on student visas that are available as a part of the underground that serves the terrorist network. A little closer screening and checking and verifying identity on people that are in here, a little closer supervision perhaps while they're in the country. I don't know, but it's a subject that's got to be addressed because we have open borders, and if you're in the right area, you can come in and out of this country with virtually no problem at all. So,
but you know, closing the borders is not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it is that it's time for the American people to get educated about the world they live in. That is what is fundamentally missing in this society, that for so long we just became complacent because we thought we didn't have any natural enemy. Now we understand that there's a real enemy there, and it's the responsibility of every American living in this country to understand precisely what Islam is, what does it teach, how do Muslims live, how do people who believe in these radicalized ideas, whether they're Muslims or not.
Sure.
What are they all about? This is our responsibility as people now. We have to do this.
You know, we had...
And Jack, sealing the borders is unrealistic.
Well, of course it is.
For all sorts of reasons, not least of which is that there's a huge demand for both legal and illegal immigration in this country.
I mean, there wasn't Vicente Fox just in the country meeting with Bush about what to do with 3 million Mexican immigrants who work in this country and make a huge economic contribution to the...
And the idea of unleashing the INS, even if there was sufficient manpower, which there isn't, to go through the country and root out illegal immigrations is a prescription for a police state, and that is not what America is all about.
You know, we had, going back to the late 80s, I mean, we've had it awfully good in this country for the last 10 or 12, 13 years. Reagan and the lads who got together and got the Berlin Wall down and ended the Cold War. We had the situation in the Persian Gulf, which was short and clean, and there were not a lot of American casualties. Coming out of the 1991 recession, the stock market and the economy entered an unprecedented era of prosperity where people in this country got wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. And it was like, what me worry? I mean, there were no problems. Life was good. People were educating their kids and buying second homes and driving nice cars, and they had high-paying jobs. And that's I think part of the reason why this was such an emotional blockbuster to everybody. I mean, it's if we had been scraping and struggling, that had been, you know, it's like here's one more thing. But such a contrast to the way life has been in this country, with the possible exception of the stock market. We're going to get, I think, CNNI now. Are we not, Ellie? Are we ready to go to them? They have a live interview with a Pakistani foreign minister, and presumably we're going to at least hear some questions about the delegation for Pakistan that went to deliver ultimatums to the Taliban in Afghanistan demanding the return or handing over of Osama bin Laden. So let's go now to our sister network, CNNI, for that interview.
And at this point, we welcome our viewers in the United States as we go to Pakistan and examine its critical decision to back the United States as it zeroes in on the culprits of Tuesday's attacks. Joining us now is Pakistani Foreign Minister Abdul Sattar. Mr. Sattar, thank you very much for joining us. First, if we can start with what's going on right now in Kandahar. What's the Pakistani delegation telling the Taliban this day?
The Pakistani delegation at a high level will be conveying to the Taliban government of Afghanistan the imperative of compliance with Security Council resolutions, both those that have been adopted in the past and the one that was adopted on the 12th of September. That is our own policy, and we hope that the government of Afghanistan will act with responsibility in the terribly grave situation raised by these horrendous terrorist attacks in New York and Washington.
For those not familiar with the minutiae of Security Council resolutions, can you tell us exactly what those Security Council resolutions say?
The Security Council resolution calls for international cooperation by all states in the efforts to deal with the terrorists, organizers, and sponsors of these attacks in New York and Washington.
As one of a handful of countries...
Also, I think we should take note...
If I could just break in there for a moment, as one of the handful of countries that actually supports the Taliban regime, is that all that the delegation is going armed with, the UN Security Councils that have already been in place for some time, or is Pakistan putting some extra muscle on the Taliban to surrender Osama bin Laden?
Well, Pakistan has always sought to give correct counsel. We have always emphasized in the past that it is important for Afghanistan and its people that the government should act in conformity with international law. Of course, the assumption that Pakistan is in a position to exercise complete influence is flawed in our opinion. We have constantly pointed out to our friends that we have diplomatic relations, but that doesn't necessarily translate into great influence. The decisions have to be made by the sovereign government of Afghanistan.
As seems likely, as many analysts are speculating anyway, it's very unlikely that the Taliban is going to surrender Osama bin Laden in the near future. Mullah Omar has only recently said that there's no way that's going to happen and has actually threatened retaliation if anyone attacks Afghanistan. What's Pakistan going to do then?
Well, Pakistan has taken very serious note of the threat that has been hurled against Pakistan. We are terribly saddened that a government and a country that we have regarded always as a neighbor, friend, should use such language against a neighbor which is quite clearly in their mind Pakistan. And I'm sure that the emissaries who have gone to Kandahar will take that up with the leadership in Kandahar.
So you feel that was actually a direct threat on Islamabad?
Meanwhile, well, if you read that statement very carefully, it was certainly aimed at Pakistan because the language, although veiled, left no doubt in our mind that the threat was against the government and people of Pakistan.
So the government's been threatened. The Pakistani government has also said that it will be part of the coalition against terrorism. So what's Pakistan actually going to do? Is it going to allow ground troops in Pakistan to stage attacks into Afghanistan if that so becomes necessary as far as the Pentagon is concerned? Will air bases be allowed to be used within Pakistan's borders? What exactly? Give us the specifics then of Pakistan's support for this international coalition.
The discussions that we have held with the government of the United States deal with principles in general. Pakistan will extend full cooperation in the fight against terrorism. As for the specifics, we expect consultations, and we understand from the news that a group of high-level officials from the United States will be visiting Pakistan in the near future. We would like also to know the plan that the United States has in mind, and then we will discuss what and to what extent Pakistan can be a partner in the fight against terrorism.
Pakistani politics has long been seen as factional politics. It's never necessarily thought that when the Pakistani president says one thing, that all the factions within the government are necessarily behind him. Is the government united in General Musharraf's stand? Is indeed the Inter-Services Intelligence Organization, which has long been a very important factor in Pakistani government, whether admitted, whether overt or covert, is that actually behind fighting terrorism, as it's called, and fighting the Taliban?
First of all, there is no difference whatsoever within the government of Pakistan. The president of Pakistan has had very close consultations with all segments of opinion, also political and religious opinion in the country. Yesterday, he spent 14 hours with more than 100 political and religious personalities in the country. And I can tell you that while there are differences at the political level in regard to precise policies, there is no difference on broad outline of policy. Firstly, all the people, political, religious leaders, have unanimously condemned the acts of terrorism. They have pointed out that Islam does not permit attacks on innocent people. They have also pointed out that Islam, a religion of peace, abhors acts of terrorism. As for precise policies, there is naturally some difference of opinion, but as I've said, on broad lines, Pakistan must be seen and must participate in implementation of the resolutions calling for the fight against international terrorism.
But to put it on the line, though, Mr. Sattar, will Pakistan support a military strike on Afghanistan if that's what the Pentagon chooses to do?
Well, we have to wait to hear the plan, and only then can the government of President Musharraf make final decisions. I cannot deal with, as you know, such contingencies without knowing what precisely are the plans.
You mentioned that Islam is not a religion of war, it's a peaceful religion, that the people who carried out these attacks do not represent Islam as a religion. Nonetheless, there has been a certain amount of understanding expressed in Pakistan, even as people are disgusted and horrified by the attack in New York, as to why the United States might have been targeted. Now, this is something that's quite mystifying to many in the United States, and we have many viewers in the United States watching right now, as well as our international audience. Do you think you could explain why, when our correspondents went into Pakistan, into various cities in Pakistan, that there was some sense of understanding as to why the attacks took place? Explain that to our American audience.
For a long period of time, there have been sentiments in the country that in many areas of the world, power is being used, force is being used unjustly. And the sense of justice and of conformity with principles of international law is very strong among Muslim people. And therefore, when they see violations of human rights and of use of state terrorism in parts of the world, they naturally react with sympathy for the innocent victims of these acts. Now, there is a very clear recognition in Pakistan about the gravity of the situation in the wake of this catastrophe in New York and Washington. All political leaders the president consulted yesterday, all leaders of religious parties who met him, were unanimous in the view that Pakistan must act in conformity with principles of international law and justice, that Pakistan must implement the resolutions of the Security Council that I have already mentioned. I think you can expect that in the days ahead, all the religious and political leaders who have met with the President will play their role to ensure that our people understand fully the grave situation that has arisen and will endorse the policy of Pakistan in favor of implementation of principles of international law and justice.
Nonetheless, Islamic groups across Pakistan have said that if Pakistan continues to support some sort of coalition against Afghanistan or against terrorism, or is seen to be supporting some sort of war on the Islamic world, they're going to cause a lot of trouble. They're going to actually try and overthrow General Musharraf's regime. How serious do you think that threat is?
Well, as I've said, first of all, there is a very broad consensus in Pakistan. If there are groups who have other opinions, they have to act within the confines of law obtaining in Pakistan. The government of Pakistan will have to deal with any attempts to violate the law. Now, let me also endorse the point you have made. The government of Pakistan will face a difficult situation at home. Our friends in the United States and the world know about it. We hope they will also recognize it in their expectations of Pakistan.
With respect to Foreign Minister, with respect
to the determination.
If the government's main defense is the rule of law, of course the government came into power with a military coup, which wasn't, of course, in the realms of Pakistani law. Is that, I mean, how can the government rely on the law in Pakistan if its own legitimacy is in question because it didn't come into power within the confines of the law?
I would be very happy to discuss with you the background to the events of October 12, 1999, but let me say two things. The Supreme Court of Pakistan has given a ruling that allows the President Musharraf's government to institute reforms and strengthen the foundations for sustainable democracy. 3 years have been allowed, and the government has already announced the roadmap for elections to take place in the first half of the month of October in 2002. I think that issue is basically resolved.
Is it going to calm the people on the streets, though? Foreign Minister, is that going to calm the people on the streets? Can we, in fact, expect General Musharraf to address the people of Pakistan to explain his position? Some have wondered why he hasn't done that already.
Well, the President of Pakistan has been working very hard over the last few days to, first of all, fully take into confidence opinion leaders in the country, in the government, outside the government. Secondly, he expects that as a result of the discussions that were held over nearly 14 hours yesterday with political and religious personalities, they would project their own understanding of what is good for Pakistan. Thirdly, the President of Pakistan intends today or tomorrow to address the nation, take them into confidence, explain to our people the gravity of the present situation and the need for responsible responses, not only on the part of the government, but also of the broad masses of the people.
Just very quickly, the President is going to travel to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as China, but Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the only other two countries to recognize the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Are we going to see some united action? Are we going to see the cutting off of all recognition of the Taliban regime from the three of your powers?
The President has not yet scheduled these visits. Let me say we are in very close contact with the leadership of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Similarly, we are in close contact with our other friends, notably China, and we are also in the process of establishing close consultations with our other friends. I think the news that you have seen that the president will be traveling to China today or tomorrow anticipates decisions in this respect.
All right, forgive me there, Foreign Minister, for jumping the gun then, but thank you very much for your time. And watching that interview with us was Major Garrett at the White House, and he already has some reaction to that interview. Major.
Well, not official reaction, Shiab, from the White House, but I can assure you that members of the Bush administration at the State Department and no doubt at the White House either were watching or will be soon going over the transcript word by word. It's a fascinating behind-the-scenes negotiations going on between the United States government and the Pakistani government. The Pakistani government has made it very clear, quite often through the good global offices of CNN, what it's looking for if it joins as robustly as it's promised to this U.S. coalition against global terrorism. It's looking for a couple of things. Lifting of economic sanctions against the country imposed by the U.S. Congress, signed by Bill Clinton after Pakistan tested a nuclear weapon in 1998, looking for an aid package, and also looking for U.S. assistance in resolving its ongoing dispute with the Indian government over Kashmir. The White House has not publicly committed to any of those issues. Internally, there's a good deal of resistance in dealing at all with the Kashmir dispute, but there is expressed privately a willingness to deal with the Pakistani government on the question of economic sanctions and economic aid, although the White House, at least publicly, is not acknowledging that. Also, Secretary of State Colin Powell said on Sunday that, in fact, a high-level State Department delegation will be traveling to Pakistan in the very near future. He told Wolf Blitzer that it has not been decided who will lead that delegation. I'm quoting the Secretary of State here. He appeared on Late Edition with Wolf Blitzer on Sunday, but I'm sure the Secretary of State said it will not be in the distant future. I would expect in the very near future, in the next several days. And we'll put the team together and determine who the leader of that team will be. And when they go over, they will also be working with our ambassador, Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain, who's been doing such a great job over there in the last 4 days. Those are the direct quotes from Secretary of State Colin Powell. And then Wolf Blitzer asked the Secretary of State about Pakistan's request to the United States that if, in fact, there is a joint military campaign and the target is Afghanistan and Pakistan's complicity is publicly known, that India and the Israeli government not participate. Wolf Blitzer asked the Secretary of State about that. He said, well, we'll see what their position is. We'll talk to them. And right now, you know, we are not planning. We don't have a multinational force going anywhere yet. And so we understand the sensitivities that would be involved in anything that might involve India or Israel. So clearly the United States stepping very gingerly around Pakistani concerns, trying to work with them as best they can to maintain a sharp and well-defined coalition with them. Shiab.
Major, it was pretty clear, though, from that interview with Foreign Minister Sattar that he's very keen to frame the events, the coalition and what might be about to happen in terms of the United Nations resolutions. And indeed, if the United States, under international law, is considering any military retaliation, it should theoretically go through the UN Security Council. Surely that will preserve the international coalition and give the Arab world and other nations more peace of mind, as opposed to any kind of unilateral action. And yet we haven't had any mention of the United Nations being consulted at all as yet, or the Security Council being convened.
Well, no, the Foreign Minister mentioned the Security Council resolution passed on Tuesday, which was an overall condemnation of the terrorist attacks on New York and Virginia and the downing of the crash of the plane in Pennsylvania, all related to the various terrorist attacks. And yes, we would be seeing if, in fact, the UN Security Council were involved and there were an umbrella resolution passed, we would see the exact same type of situation that happened in the Gulf War. That was a cohesive, a glue, if you will, that kept the coalition together and gave many, particularly moderate Arab countries and those who were less eager to jump in the coalition against Iraq, diplomatic cover within their own countries, saying this is not about common cause with the United States, but it is about common cause with the United Nations. It's so much easier for countries in these regions to do that because there is much less internal hostility to the United Nations, because oftentimes the United Nations acts on their behalf in confronting the Western world about issues of economics, human rights, and other matters. So the UN Security Council, probably in the next few days, we will see an effort built there to provide some overall authorization. The President's administration has made it clear the coalition will be broad, it will be sustained. Probably one of the difficulties so far is providing the exact wording for something the UN Security Council would in fact endorse, because, as the administration has pointed out so regularly, this will be a long-running and not necessarily nation-specific or individual-specific campaign. So how do you write something the entire United Nations Security Council can endorse that would be that nebulous? That's one of the challenges ahead.
Major Garrett, thank you very much for your analysis. And for our viewers in the United States, we now return you to CNN.
All right, thank you very much, Jeb. I'm Jack Cafferty. It's coming up on 1:59 in the morning. Quickly, before we wind this up, Mansour, what did we hear from the foreign minister?
Well, you heard a lot of diplomatic speak, if you will. Here's what the reality is. General Musharraf has to deal with three constituencies. The first one is his Islamic hardliners within the army and the intelligence apparatus who support the Taliban and have supported them for a long time. The second are the religious zealots on the streets. The third are the hardliners in